But my name is Terry Beatty, and when I was asked to be the introducer, this was a lucky day for me on multiple levels. From a personal standpoint, I've been a member of Montgomery history for 36 years now, so almost half of it's 75, and was on the board for 12 years, president for 2 terms, have stayed active recruiting and being a supporter. And it's great to see some old friends here today, and it's wonderful to see all of you. I'm a history crazy, and I'm pretty sure that most people here feel the same way, that if we forget about our history, deny our history, distort our history, we're losing something very valuable, which is going to be important in trying to figure out where we go from where we are now to the future. And so for those of us who feel that's important and history's under pressure in the schools and elsewhere, organizations like this and events like this give us a chance to rally around with people who share those values and enjoy each other and go back out and spread the word. So it's great to be here, and Matt Logan, thank you very much for having me. In my day job, I'm a senior partner at Brown Advisory, which is an investment management firm that traces its roots back to Alex Brown and Sons in Baltimore, which was started in 1820 and was the oldest investment firm in the United States. So there's a lot of history there, and maybe 1820 has something to do with Nathan Loughborough, too. So it's an investment firm, but values its history. We have offices several places around the world, and we manage assets for families, for retirement plans, for endowments. And so anybody who's interested in talking about that should just email me. But it's why I'm here with a badge, because the combination of history and my involvement, and I had another member of the firm was president of the board, means that we are proud to be sponsors for Montgomery History as an organization and for this event in particular. So again, great to be here. And then finally, I'm here on behalf of my good wife, Anne, and our house. And as you will hear later from Paige and Amy, we live in a home called Milton, or Old Loughborough, which is maybe the oldest standing house in Montgomery County, and features prominently in the middle of the River Road community that you are going to learn a lot more about. So I did not know either of these wonderful ladies. I read their paper about a week ago, and it was great fun. Actually, I just see Jane North, and Jane was the person who recruited me to join Montgomery History 36-something years ago when we bought our house, now Milton, and Jane came to me and said, "Terry, you may not know this, but when you bought this house, you also bought into the Montgomery History group." And so, Jane, thank you very much for being a great friend and recruiting me. So you're going to hear more about the house and about the Loughboroughs, but we bought it in 1983. Long story about that, but we've loved every minute of it, and we're delighted that it will play a role today. So now I'm going to pass this along to the people who are going to do the work, and you're going to really learn something from Paige, Whitley, and Amy Rispin. And I just met Paige this week, and it turns out we had met Amy a while ago, so this is renewal. And they are yin and yang. I'll skip all the degrees and stuff, but Amy is a science lady and comes at things from facts, and so the maps and all of the detail stuff you're going to see was in her ballpark. And Paige is the touchy-feely people person. So all of the scandalous stories and interrelationships that I love, and I'm sure you do, are going to be coming through Paige. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to them, and looking forward to a great hour with you.
Thanks, Terry. Let me start by saying that I live in Brookdale, which hugs Western Avenue, and I live in the last house built by a member of the historic Shoemaker family. And the way I got into history was every so often some of the descendants knock on my door, offer me scrapbooks of vintage photos, and I just couldn't help it. I just had to do this. So let's start with the 1865 Martinet Bonds map. And the stippled line is the Georgetown Rockville Pike. Note that north is going at a slant. They hadn't standardized maps quite yet. And then below that stippled line is River Road, which is not stippled, and it goes into Wisconsin Avenue now, Georgetown, Rockville Pike, at Tenleytown. And you can see, if you look carefully at the Rockville Pike, Richard Ball's and H. or Hillary Ball's wheelwright, and this was a blacksmith shop that serviced the stages and the horses that went along the pike. This will be important later on. And also, at the boundary of what's now Western Avenue and River Road was Fort Bayard, one of the bigger Civil War forts, and about 1.25 miles to its east was Fort Reno, another very large fort. 4 tobacco plantations are shown here fronting River Road. Councilman, Busey Posey, Loughborough, and Richard Williams. Each one has some frontage on River Road. You can see the number of enslaved people written in. It was substantial even in the first quarter to the mid part of the 19th century as tobacco was giving away to wheat cropping. John Councilman had inherited 444 acres from his father, Samuel, a veteran of the War of 1812. Richard Williams was a planter of English-Welsh heritage. Peter D. Posey, descended from English planters with French roots, originally settled in southern Maryland. The family then migrated up here, and he bought his 300-acre plantation from Samuel Busey. And then finally, Nathan Loughborough, who in 1800 came with the federal government from Philadelphia. He was the first comptroller of the U.S. Treasury, and he was president of the Washington Turnpike Company, which meant he was commercially minded. He moved to the Milton estate with his second wife, Harriet, and it is said that he built a special carriageway from the front of the house to what is now Massachusetts Avenue, so she wouldn't have to, I guess paper does this, so she wouldn't have to look at the slave quarters, I presume. His grandson, through his son Hamilton, obtained the land, and that grandson was James Henry Loughborough, and after the Civil War, he came to settle here. He was an unreconstructed Confederate and moved to Milton. And then finally, Samuel Shoemaker at the bottom, a Quaker of German descent. He and his 10 children came from Pennsylvania. Samuel, Charles, and Isaac leased farms along the boundary line, and they were truck farmers. So they farmed with hired help, limited hired help, and limited farming help, and themselves. And I want to quote from an article from Bethesda Journal in 1941. Before the Civil War, Mary Ann, a slave owned by the Councilman family, was hired by Charles Shoemaker's wife, Elizabeth. Mary Ann continued after the war to work for Mrs. Shoemaker until she was too old to work. And we'll hear more about Mary Ann in a little while. And then finally, Benjamin and James Ray, descendants of Montgomery County native and Revolutionary War Captain Joseph Ray. They purchased about 17 acres in a tax sale. So let's look at some of these marvelous pictures of historic estates. The upper left is the Milton Plantation house. It's built of granite quarried on the estate, and after Civil War, grandson James Henry sought commercial development of the quarry. Lower left is the Busey-Posey Springfield Plantation house, and it was acquired from Samuel Busey's family in 1837. Lower right is Louis Solyom's house. He purchased land from Crown, if you remember the small plot on the previous map. He fought in the Civil War, assimilated here, and he had a career at the Library of Congress. He was a Hungarian aristocrat before the Civil War, and his career sprang from his expertise in Slavic and later Asian languages. Finally, upper right-hand corner, the Spinning Wheel Tavern is said to date to about the Civil War. In the late 19th century, it was purchased from the Rays by Yehu Willett, who was a blacksmith, and his wife, Edith Dean, granddaughter of Samuel Shoemaker. And why would a blacksmith purchase this house and tavern? Because taverns serviced horses in those days. In 1878, we see a beginning of change. So in blue and gray, you see the plantation owners and the Shoemaker farm owners. But large plantations were no longer viable without the labor of enslaved people. And the landholders along River Road began to sell off small plots of poor land to newly freed people. And it was washed by streams and had very hilly topography. It was not suitable for row crops, so they sold off the worst first. So 8 black families owned land near River Road. In 1869, the Ray brothers sold 6 acres to Frank Ray and John Hall, and John Hall's widow Mary would eventually marry William Henry Harrison Brown. Soon after, they sold plots to Henry Jackson, William and Nelson Warren, and Jane Rivers. Then on the other side, councilmen sold 2 acres to John and Mary Burley, and another 2 acres to former slave Mary Ann and her husband, Nelson Wood, blacksmith. In 1870, in the census, we see Nelson living next door to the Balls family along Rockville Pike, and by 1873, he had moved and was probably working at the smithy associated with the spinning wheel. And according to the 1870 census, at least 5 more families probably squatted or rented land, apparently on Loughborough's property. He never sold to blacks. This marvelous picture was obtained courtesy of the Solyom family. It's called Pascal House. In 1880, Pascal Botts occupied this house, and his daughter-in-law, Cora Botts, wife of his son Jeremiah, was a servant with the Solyom family, and as you can see, he was still living there in 1895. Now the Moses Cemetery. This is a mouthful. The ancient United Order of Sons and Daughters, Sisters and Brothers of Moses, an African-American benevolent society, was founded in D.C., 1870. 1880, White's Tabernacle number 39 of the Order of Moses established a cemetery not here, but at Fort Reno in Tenleytown. Washington City planners allied with the Chevy Chase Land Company planned to put a road through the Tenleytown Cemetery, and in 1911, the Grays heirs in the upper left-hand green part sold 1.04 acres of land to White's Tabernacle number 39 as a burial site for its members. And in 1912 to 1935, we have death certificates, actually, many of them naming that cemetery off of River Road. 1912, we have Jeremiah Botts of Tenleytown, who had been a deacon of Rock Creek Baptist Church in Tenleytown. And 1935, we have Jeremiah Botts' wife, Cora Botts, buried at the Moses Cemetery. Two of the local cemeteries, which are the red dots in the background, are identified in early wills, those of Samuel Busey and Samuel Shoemaker. In the 19th century, most local burials were in the backyard, what I tell people, on the family farm or homestead. 8 historic cemeteries are all within a mile of the Moses Cemetery, which is number 1, and I want to single out 2 things. We were sure there was one cemetery if we look at Busey's will, and when we actually started looking at the old plats, we found 2 cemeteries. The question was the second one a slave or servant cemetery? Secondly, if we look at number 4, Mary Ann Wood's granddaughter, Margaret, through her son, Frank Wood, held on to the family home and cemetery, which is depicted on subdivision plats, until 1963, when she sold it to someone named McCarthy, who was assembling land for the Kenwood condo building. Finally, 1872, and when we talk about education, Maryland established a segregated school system. Colored children had separate facilities, a shorter calendar year, and lower salaries for the teachers. Until 1925, school classes were held for the River Road community in probably rented space on Loughborough's property, and then later in Mary Ann Wood's son's, Frank Wood's house. Finally, the community was given a grant from the Rosenwald Foundation. Sorry, this paper seems to get this going. And the local black families donated land and probably local labor and built this wonderful River Road colored school. And I want to mention, this was 1925, and it wasn't until 1928 that the white children in the neighborhood had a purpose-built school, and that was in Somerset. Let's go back a year, 1927, the first county high school was established in Rockville, and Margaret Wood, Frank Wood's daughter, Frank Wood's daughter and Mary Ann's granddaughter was in the first graduating class of 1931, and she's sitting on the fender of that wonderful old vehicle. The graduating class started in 27 with 41 children. 9 were able to be spared from their families' farms and jobs long enough to graduate in 1931, and this is part of the graduating class.
Thank you, Amy. Can you hear me? I'm partially deaf, so I have to ask. I want to talk now about the community of faith of the African American community on River Road and their work ties, as well as the effects of commercial development on the area. First of all, I'm reminded of Nina Clark's statement that the church is the alpha and the omega of the Black community. However, the community did not for some time have its own physical structure there. But what have we learned about it? It's difficult to know before the Civil War what the ties are. However, Nathan Loughborough was a Catholic, a converted Quaker to Catholicism, and attended Holy Trinity Catholic Church in Georgetown. And we have records of 2 enslaved marriages in the 1840s under his purview there at that church. After the Civil War, though, when the community begins to take effect, purchasing land around 1870, during the 1870s and 1880s, we do see ties. We do see ties to Georgetown, but now in the form of Mount Zion Methodist Episcopal Church, with many weddings and funerals associated with that. We also see ties to the growth in Tenleytown as downtown churches set up mission churches, one of which was Rock Creek Baptist Church, which was set up in Tenleytown in 1872 by its mother church, Vermont Avenue Baptist Church, downtown. We also, intriguingly, have hints of what I call the old blind minister. Caroline Loughborough, the great-granddaughter of Nathan Loughborough, was born at Milton Estate in 1882 and became a writer. In the preface to her poem about the old blind minister, she said the following: "The old blind minister lived in my Maryland just a few years ago. He held outdoor services every Sunday afternoon in summer and on warm days in winter. Old Miss would come out on the porch of the big house to listen to the sermon from the hill. She used to say, 'He does me good.'" Caroline goes on to describe the perfect appearance of this gentleman, dressed in a frock coat and a vest and pants, which had been given to him by the males in her family. There's obviously closeness in proximity, in hearing the words of this gentleman, as well as in some kind of family relationship with the handed-down clothing that he wore proudly. We do know some things about other individuals of the community. One is the Reverend William Armstead Jones. He was orphaned after taking part in a failed Haitian colonization attempt during the Civil War. Somehow, he made his way to the early Vermont Avenue Baptist Church in 1873, and he was adopted when his name was Armstead Harris by River Road founder Charlotte Gray, whose husband Frank Gray had been one of the 2 in 1869 to make the first purchases of land. He, in 1902, became the pastor of the said Rock Creek Baptist Church, and he reigned there for more than 40 years. And in the words of the church, he baptized, married, christened, and buried the congregation. We see many ties with marriages and funerals of the Rock Creek community with Reverend Jones at Rock Creek Baptist Church. More recently, we've uncovered new information about other ties. William Henry Harrison Brown was born enslaved in 1840, about 4 miles from Rockville, and he was a Civil War veteran of the U.S. Colored Troops. In 1873, he married Mary Hall, whose husband John Hall had been one of the 2 in 1869 to first purchase land. They were married by none other than a name you will recognize from Rockville, and that's Daniel Brogdon from Rockville. For many years, he was a preacher on the books, a local preacher of Mount Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church in Tenleytown, which itself was set up as a mission church in 1888. This title was distinct from the appointed preacher set by the Washington Circuit of the Methodist Church. He was buried in 1921 at the home place on River Road, quotes, according to testimony, along with first wife Mary Hall, who died in 1893. To understand the nexus, or why Tenleytown was so attractive. It was the center for faith and other institutions of the greater African American community, both in DC and Maryland sides. In this 1907 map, you see in green on the left the site of Mount Asbury Methodist Church, where William Brown was the local preacher, and as a trustee later in life, so was Frank Wood, the son of blacksmith Nelson Wood and his wife Mary Ann, formerly enslaved by John Councilman. In the lower section of the map, in blue, you see the location of Rock Creek Baptist Church, the church of the Reverend William Armstead Jones, and also where Jeremiah Botts was a trustee. What you probably can't discern, but I'll tell you, is that behind the church building is another small building that is labeled Hall. And this marks the site of the Moses Hall, which was created as a social center and for the working meetings of White's Tabernacle number 39, as they did their various works. Up the street in red is the Jesse Reno Colored School. And this was established in 1903. And as Amy has described the education on River Road, it was an alternative to the rented space or small spaces on River Road. Here was a spanking new government school that attracted those from the community who did indeed have friends and relatives in Tenleytown. Up in the upper right corner is circled the graveyard that Amy mentioned. This graveyard was set up in 1880, purchased by trustees of the White's Tabernacle number 39, the Moses organization. And it's caused the impetus for purchasing land in 1911 here on River Road. In 1920, as generations have slowly shifted, there were no Baptist churches in Bethesda. And founded in Scotland community in 1920, Macedonia Baptist Church came into being. It was led by the Reverend William Mason, who himself was a son of Mount Calvary Baptist Church of Rockville. And in 1927, Mason bought a spit of land on Elm Street in Bethesda in the Miller's Addition to serve the growing community there of laborers and their families for industry that had been set up in the area. 10 years later, the church moved to River Road, where first it was held in a house church on the school and cemetery side of River Road. In 1945, the church purchased the home of William Clipper, and after renovation, it is still there at this site on the corner of River Road and Clipper Lane, where it's called the Little Church on the Hill. Right now, Macedonia is an advocate for the descendant community with disputes concerning the Moses Cemetery. It and its supporters, like the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, basically protest further development of the land, and they also advocate for having a memorial for both the cemetery and for this original African American community. I want to take a moment to talk about new blood. As Terry noticed, I'm a people person. I want to know stories. And no community, no family can remain an island unto itself. It needs new blood. And two families that were coming in the 1910s and 1920s that helped reinvigorate the original families were the Clippers and the Hattons. The photo on the left shows Seneca Quarry and Patriarch Jack Clipper, who is second from the right. He himself was enslaved in Hanover County, Virginia, and oncoming Union troops freed him. He made his way north to Baltimore and then slowly down the coast, finally settling in Seneca. And basically, he married Martha Johnson from the Big Woods community, and they had 13 children. In the 1890s, he's on the government books, he and his three eldest sons, working at the Seneca's quarry. In 1910, his three youngest sons, William, Cleveland, and Isaac Clipper, moved to River Road. William Clipper had married one of the Warren children, okay, Blanche. Isaac was a driver at the Naval Observatory, and I'm going to come back to them more in a moment. Another family that was integral in the community that moved in 1920s was the Pinkney Hatton family, originally from the Carolinas. He came from via Georgetown to River Road, and with the help of his brother-in-law, built the first substantial four-bedroom home on River Road. Pinkney also worked at the U.S. Naval Observatory. Perhaps that's how he knew about this place with Isaac Clipper. Who knows? Anyway, he was a driver for A&P and Piggly Wiggly, until with business acumen, he amassed a truck fleet himself, and his property was such that there was a large house in front and there was room in the back for the truck fleet. Later in his life, he had instead a cab fleet, and it was he to whom the maids and the school children in the area turned to get around in the community. I want to now turn our attention to work and the eventual commercial development of the area. While this map says 1904, frankly, I would say 1890 is a better indicator of changes coming. By 1890, the trolley system, which is, you'll see the letter A, the trolley system had met from Georgetown all the way to the DC border in Friendship Heights, and by 1900 it went all the way to Rockville. One avenue to move people further afield in the hopes of jobs and possible home relocation. Across the bottom of the map, you'll see in red the Glen Echo Electric Railway, which also by 1900 moved people east and west from Connecticut Avenue to Cabin John and back via Glen Echo. These two, the last item is marked by C, and that is the Georgetown branch of the B&O Railroad, also known as Metropolitan Southern. This started in 1890. We can see deeds starting to transfer over from the families of the Loughboroughs and the Warrens, and et cetera. And by 1910, it was completed, and it was strictly an 11-mile freight train railway that moved coal and building supplies from Georgetown to Bethesda. And we know it now as the Capitol Crescent Trail. Up in the top, you'll see circled a new employer that came to what was a basically agrarian area. Although some grandchildren of the Warrens were working at the C&O Canal, and we knew that Melson Wood was a blacksmith, by this time, it's still agrarian until in 1897, the U.S. Department of Agriculture moves its outfit, which had been having animals roam on the National Mall, to this farm site out in relatively clean and sparsely populated Bethesda. The USDA's Station of Animal Industry, also known as the Vet Station, was a huge employer for at least 6 to 7 heads of household in the African American community. Cleveland and his brother William Clipper worked there, as well as others. And the stories were that it was a good job. William Clipper, later in life, boasted that he had ridden zebras on Wisconsin Avenue. And I truly thought this was a tall tale until I noted a 1907 newspaper article saying that the zebra President Roosevelt had just received was now at the Bethesda station, and that they were considering crossbreeding the zebra with the horse for a new breed called the Zeb horse. So good for William Clipper there. In this real estate map of 1907, you can see most of the families highlighted are still remaining. We've got the Browns, which was the Halls. We've got descendants of the Grays. We have the Rivers families and descendants of the Warrens on one side of the street. On the other side of the street, William Clipper is highlighted. His two brothers are in the same strip, but that entire triangle is still mostly Wood descendants. But we see the beginnings of outsiders coming in. In 1916, Allen E. Walker had bought land from the Loughboroughs and had taken over their old quarry to set up the Bethesda Blue Granite Company. And this was another source of local employment. Soon, Allen E. Walker would also set up the Loughborough Oil Company or the Auto Supply Company, basically huge tanks, each holding 20,000 gallons of fuel, were warehoused here for what Walker saw wisely as a growing population of car and truck use in the greater DC area. As time moves on, I want to note 3 things in the 1931 real estate map showing both sides of River Road. First of all, you won't see the Moses Cemetery on it. And this is one of those curious erasures. It appeared in 1917. It doesn't appear in the real estate map of 1931. It doesn't appear in the real estate map of 1955. However, it does reappear in 1958. These and things like following the cemetery delineations in deeds happen. And is it purposeful or accidental? We don't know. But it is a type of erasure. We do see more development in the area. The arrow on the left points to the symbol for the quarry, but by this time period in 1931, it had filled with groundwater and was no longer viable. However, just across the way, at 4 o'clock from the quarry, the oil company still remains, the warehousing of fuel. We also see a few other businesses coming up in terms of a stone form corporation, which made bricks and concretes and was another employer to locals in the area. The rivers are still there. The Reverend Jones still owns land. The Board of Education is now on the site of the Foreign Warren land. On the other side of River Road, we see a new big business, which was the George Fuller Stone Corporation. It was established here on this site in 1926, and it used the freight railway to import Indiana limestone for cutting and shaping. And this Indiana limestone is seen in the U.S. Supreme Court building and the Washington National Cathedral. And some of our residents worked there as watchmen. On either side of the Fuller Stone Corp., the land was held still by Allen E. Walker. There was the Lake Store Artificial Stone Company. But in the grassy field below it, I wanted to put the symbol of the baseball field, because here it's not all work, there is some play. The River Road Lions was the local colored baseball team that the community had in the late 20s and 30s and beyond. And it played as far away as Olney, Maryland, as well as downtown in Georgetown at 37th and Prospect. The community rallied around the team. It was a social event. They helped support purchase of equipment, and the Hattons even drove the team to the various games in the area. I'm going to end with two rare aerial photographs to look about changes. First of all, in this 1954 aerial, you can see the dotted line is River Road, bisecting the photo left and right, and we're looking into DC. We're looking south to Tenleytown. The woods, Margaret Wood, and an uncle or two still remain in a tiny triangle in that section there, near number 1. Macedonia Baptist Church, the little church on the hill, is there. You can even see next to number 3, the 4-square Sears Roebuck house that the Hattons owned. On the other side of River Road, number 4 is tucked away too much, but the Moses Cemetery remains. However, it's overgrown and in this angle partially obscure. However, next to number 5, the Rivers farmhouse still remains, and they're still in the area. And actually, the school building still exists. However, by 1954, Brown versus Board of Education has marked changes, and within 2 years, it will close. In terms of business, we see a marked change from heavy industry to lighter industry and service industry. The large building that you see on the left side, next to the railroad track that runs from 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock roughly, that was the George Fuller Company, but in this photo is actually undergoing extensive renovation to become the headquarters for Hot Shops Incorporated, which we know of as Marriott. Thank you very much. In what used to be the blank fields next to the building, we can still see a faint outline where the baseball was next to River Road. However, the other area has been taken up with defense-oriented companies that came into being during World War II. You know, Briggs Infiltration and other companies. On the right side, you can see a few little oil tanks slightly above number 6 on the other side of the railroad tracks. They remain. But the rest of the businesses that have influxed the area are small businesses. They're auto repair shops, furniture repair stores. We see at the conjunction of where River Road and the railway crossing is, on the left is DGS Grocery, across the way is Talbert's Ice and Beverage. And for any of you in that area, just look at how much parking is available right now. this is only a 2-lane country road going on. What changes? This photo was miraculously discovered in a storage room on the site of Washington Episcopal School, which used to be the headquarters of Marriott, which used to be Hot Shop's headquarters, which used to be the Fuller Stone Company. In this 1963 photo, we see ever more changes. And in this photo, the last of the original descendants, the Rivers family and the Woods family, have finally sold the properties. Little Falls Parkway is under construction, number 3 up above. Milton, thankfully, is still there, Terry, so good for you. We see River Road again bisecting this photo. The little church on the hill, Macedonia, still remains, and there are some members of the African American community still here, just not of the original families, and those have more recently moved in the 30s, are members of Macedonia. Ella Watkins lives next to the church. Near number 8 and number 1 is the Matthews family. On the other side of the road, the Rivers family has left. The heirs have sold off the land, and the outline of the Moses Cemetery remains here because, curiously, the current owner, Laszlo Talber, he has built the Westwood Shopping Center. He's getting ready to build in a few years the Westwood Tower, and he has moved land and changed the topography and asphalted, except for this spot in this photo. Things have changed, and I guess our parting words in conclusion would be that the history of this African American community mirrors the histories of many in the area. Friends and family gathered together, bought land, usually marginal land, and built a community based on the wishes of education for their children, based on ties of faith and mutual support, and then either outsider speculation or better opportunities or a combination of the both. The community dwindles and moves away. We're going to stop here, and we could talk on and on and on about this, but we're going to allow time for questions and answers. Thank you very much. Any questions? Any microphones? Okay, there's one.
What would you say were the boundaries of this area?
The boundaries of which area? Of specifically the African American community?
Yes.
Do you live in the area? Do you know the landmarks? All right, then let's go to...
The 1917 map pretty well shows where the black families were.
You have streets like today's street names?
Excuse me?
Streets. What are the names of the streets?
Well, there's River Road, and then there's...
We need to go to...
Whoops,
sorry. Right. In the corner of number 3, Little Falls Parkway.
Okay.
River Road. 2, they have now created West Bard at the upper corner where the Willets took over the spinning wheel. So we'll say in that cohort there.
Right, that it's basically the outer reaches of what we see in 1917, and one of the reasons it was so compact was this was washed by the Willett Branch and Little Falls Parkway. It flooded, it was hilly, and it wasn't very useful, but it did have this heavy industry which provided, within walking distance, a lot of employment.
Hi, I'm over here. Can you go a little bit further up River Road? There's a historic house that's there right now. I think it's a blacksmith's house right near Seven Locks Road and River Road. And do you have any history about that or know about it? It's currently there.
Right, there's a wonderful sign talking about the Magruders.
Yeah, but you can never actually stop and read the sign. So I was wondering, because it's busy intersection.
It's very interesting. Okay. All I know, it's part of the Magruder family who was out in that area on the other side of the road where that blacksmith shop is, on the Potomac Highway border, was the Lily Stone land, okay, the famous quarry that's Tri-State Stone right now. And further down the road, closer to the river, is another traditional African-American community called Gibson Grove. And you all know, every family has ties all over the place. And we find in this historical era, there are ties of family between the Gibson Grove group as well as the River Road group as well. But Magruders, and they're slightly on the other side north of that. And that is also the area where William Councilman, brother to this John Councilman, had land. That's right. We travel on our history on these roads.
If I could interject another point, you talked about the geographic boundaries of the community, but as I've started to do interviews with living descendants, there was a virtual community tied together by African American Baptist Church. There was one Mount Glory on MacArthur Boulevard. There was one in Georgetown. There was Rock Creek Baptist in Tenleytown. And there was a tremendous regular intercourse. People were ministering in all of these places, sometimes several of them. So it's not just the geographic, it's also the virtual boundaries.
I've got the microphone, so I'm going to ask a question. Sorry, Dan. The last photograph you had was from 1963, I believe.
Mm-hmm. This way.
And it appeared that the cemetery site was...
It should go.
Why is that not advancing?
I don't know. You have that one?
Let's see. I'm sorry. We're having technical difficulties. Did we touch something?
No, you're fine.
Okay, keep going. Okay.
There we go.
Got it.
Did you indicate that it's paved on either side around that site?
Of what?
Of the,
Are we talking about the Moses Cemetery?
of the cemetery?
It is paved. What has happened during the 30s and then later in the 50s, we had the natural Willett Branch concretized, which current advocates are asking to unconcrete and become natural stream. We also had sewer systems, and surprise, the community here was one of the last to get a good sewer system in the 20th century for its community. On the large part of the trapezoid or end, that is the concrete Willett stream. And then it's surrounded by the parking lot on the other side. Does that partly answer your question?
Well, what I'm wondering is it almost appears as if, because the pavement stopped right on those, that there was an awareness of what may have been on that site.
We think there was.
That's the conclusion we come to.
Okay.
Smart guy,
I
Matt.
was-
Matt, yeah. That's
And
what
so
we think.
between 1963 and, do we go beyond 1963, or is that
We would require another 2 hours to talk about the current boundaries and laws and things. Suffice to say, there were eyewitness accounts when this was finally, when Westwood Tower building was finally being built, that the bell get dinging for the construction crew because bones were being found. There was an account by Parks and Planning historians in an interview with the son of the architect of the tower, who was told of going off as a child with his father and someone else in a car with a bag of bones to a priest with a bag of bones to Howard Chapel. We, through our own research, have gone through genealogies of all the original families as best we can and identified when we can death certificates and noted where those burials were taking place. And even before 1911, there were burials marked in for Charlotte Gray and others in Montgomery County or River Road or some inexplicably Graysville. I'd really like to know about the Grays about that. So we assume, and from affidavits from William Brown's pension file, U.S. Civil War pension file, various people tested the fact that he and his wife, his first wife Mary, were buried next door on the property. So,
Yeah, Paige identified 20 burials spanning 1912, from before until after, but the whole thing is absolutely fascinating. There is only one documented source that says that bodies were ever moved away from the Moses Cemetery, and that source is Judith Helms' Tenleytown. And I've looked through all of her interviews, and she's basing it on thin air. So there is a legend bodies were moved. The only bodies that were moved is probably when Tauber engaged his contractor to reconfigure this very hilly cemetery, create a trench down below, and push the land and any graves down into the trench, still on that trapezoidal area. But nothing was ever moved by the Snowden family, for example.
So was there a break in the descendants so that nobody was coming back to try and care for the graves? Is that what happened?
yes. Sorry that was so short, but yes.
That has happened with white cemeteries, too. We went through a fallow period from about 1975 until maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when people had just forgotten about taking care of or remembering cemeteries, with one exception that I know of, which is descendants of Isaac Shoemaker for maybe 150 years, and one of them is here, have been coming to the Isaac Shoemaker family plot a block from my house in Brookdale every year and bringing flowers. And they do advocate for that cemetery, which is under severe and unwarranted development pressure.
Hi, thanks very much. So if you go to the Moses Cemetery today, what do you see?
Should have ended with that photograph. A parking lot with a huge drop-off into the concretized Willett Stream. On the, yeah. I can't read the future, so I don't know what is to come. Advocates for the cemetery say enough desecration, and various groups leery of further development would rather see a naturalized park with memorials in some fashion marking this community that used to live here and the cemetery. We actually have a great opportunity to have memorial markers and a walking tour. Sadly, a radio tower sits on the site of the colored school, all right? The cemetery is a parking lot. We have various areas we know where people lived, and yet they've been turned into commercial development. Anybody else? Well, we thank you very much on a Saturday afternoon for coming out and listening, and we appreciate you. Thank you.